In 1945, the physical machinery of global war ground to a halt, leaving behind a continent of ruined cityscapes. But even as the artillery fell silent, a new kind of tension began to hum through the static of the first cathode ray tube screens. The alliance that defeated the Axis powers collapsed almost immediately. Washington and Moscow emerged from the rebel with completely incompatible visions for how the world should be governed. The arrival of nuclear weapons changed the calculus of conquest. A direct military strike between these two superpowers invited total, mutual annihilation, a scenario so absolute it made traditional battlefield victories impossible. With global suicide as the only outcome of physical combat, the struggle for supremacy retreated from the borders and moved into the mind. In 1947, President Harry Truman formalized this ideological divide. He defined the world as a choice between two ways of life, one based on free institutions, the other on terror and repression. Governing those ways of life required a massive investment in psychological preparation. To sustain high military spending during peacetime, both capitals had to engineer a curated reality for their own citizens. They found their first laboratory in the mountains of Greece. As a local civil war broke out in 1946, the superpowers used the conflict to test their ability to shape international public opinion. The tactics refined in the Greek mountains provided a repeatable strategy for managing global perception for the next 4 decades. Greek and American officials needed to turn a localized political dispute into a moral crusade. They reframed the Civil War as the front line in an existential defense of Western civilization. On the island of Makronissos, thousands of suspected communists were held in exile and subjected to brutal physical and psychological violence. Yet, the official propaganda presented a very different image. This English-language booklet was distributed to the international community, describing the prison as a progressive center for civic readaptation. It showed soldiers building model Parthenons to suggest a benign educational environment. The success of the Makronissos campaign showed that state-sponsored violence could be repackaged as humanitarian progress through the use of heroic, classical iconography. By 1949, the focus shifted from managing the image of prisoners to celebrating the image of a thriving anti-communist society during Work and Victory Week. This massive parade down New York's Fifth Avenue was presented as a spontaneous outpouring of support. In reality, it was a precision-engineered media event coordinated by the U.S. State Department and Hollywood studio executives. The campaign unified the demands of total war with the demands of peacetime productivity. It told civilians that their daily labor was a weapon used to eradicate an ideological disease. When every channel of information, from newsreels to the pulpit, broadcasts the same message, a state can manufacture a complete ideological consensus. This blueprint scaled into a global information arms race. Official networks like the Voice of America began broadcasting in dozens of languages, projecting Western messages directly past the borders of the Iron Curtain. The U.S. also deployed its cultural reach, using Hollywood films and consumer brands as ideas ambassadors. These products exported the allure of capitalist prosperity into every market they could reach. The Soviet agitprop machine countered by pitching a Marxist-Leninist paradise to newly independent colonies. They offered a socialist alternative to what they labeled capitalist imperialism in Africa and Asia. In the shadows, the CIA and KGB engaged in disinformation campaigns. They forged documents and planted fake news stories, creating a climate where the true source of information was often impossible to identify. By the 1960s, the planet was divided by more than just military alliances. Citizens on both sides lived within two competing, vertically engineered versions of reality. The state's monopoly on that reality depended on the controlled pace of radio and print. The introduction of television into the domestic living room fundamentally broke that control. The Vietnam War became history's first uncensored, televised conflict. Journalists had unprecedented access to the front lines, capturing raw footage of soldiers jumping from helicopters directly into active combat zones. This chart tracks U.S. victory claims versus public support from 1965 to 1970. While government briefings reported steady progress, the nightly news broadcast the reality of civilian casualties. After the 1968 Tet Offensive, The gap between official narrative and visual truth became insurmountable. Visual evidence captured by the camera proved powerful enough to unravel a manufactured reality, helping to drive the political collapse of the American war effort. Military leaders viewed the transparency of the Vietnam era as a catastrophic failure. They concluded that unrestricted media access made fighting a modern war almost impossible. The British government applied these lessons during the 1982 Falklands War. They restricted journalists to a small, dependent pool, ensuring that every image and report was subject to rigorous military censorship before it could reach London. This strategy of total containment culminated in the 1983 invasion of Grenada. The U.S. military excluded the press entirely, allowing the government to release only the most sanitized, perfectly orchestrated images of victory. The Cold War changed the nature of power. In a world of perpetual psychological struggle, geopolitical supremacy belongs to whoever controls the lens through which the public perceives reality.